In 1870, bird shit was worth billions. By 1900, it was worthless. A single German invention obliterated a global empire built on guano, and nobody saw it coming. In 1870, a Peruvian guano island was more valuable than a gold mine. The bird droppings accumulated on the barren rocks of the Chincha Islands off Peru's coast in the cold Humboldt Current contained nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in concentrations found nowhere else on Earth. A single ton sold for $500. Peru exported 400,000 tons per year. Do the math, $200 million annually in the 1870s. In today's currency, that's roughly $2 billion. For context, Peru's entire national budget was smaller. This wasn't a niche commodity. It was the commodity. British merchants controlled the trade. American clipper ships raced to load it. Russian nobles bought it. Japanese farmers planted by it. The Guano Islands weren't pleasant places. Workers enslaved Africans, Chinese coolies, Peruvian criminals died regularly from the ammonia fumes, the heat, the disease. They scraped the crust with hand tools, working naked or half-naked, their lungs burning. But their suffering produced the fertilizer that fed Europe's exploding population. Without guano, there was no industrial agriculture. Without industrial agriculture, there was no industrial Europe. The trade enriched Peru's elite so completely that the nation built railroads, funded armies, fought wars over guano deposits. Britain's exchequer depended on the tax revenues. The entire global food system rested on bird shit. And then, in the 1870s, two German chemists named Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch began asking a radical question: why depend on birds at all? The chemistry was simple. The problem was everything else. In 1909, Fritz Haber succeeded where nature had spent millennia. He pulled nitrogen directly from the air, locked it into ammonia, made it captive. Within a decade, Karl Bosch scaled the process in factories. The Haber-Bosch synthesis didn't just create fertilizer. It rewrote the rules of survival itself. But the guano merchants didn't see it coming. Not really. They had warnings. As early as the 1860s, British chemists had begun manufacturing superphosphate, a processed fertilizer made from mineral phosphate and sulfuric acid. It worked. It was cheaper to transport than guano. It didn't rake. By 1870, Peru's export volumes were already softening. Prices wavered. Investors noticed. Some departed. The merchants told themselves it was temporary, cyclical. They had survived competition before. What they didn't grasp was that they weren't competing with a product. They were competing with chemistry itself, with the ability to manufacture fertility from nothing. The Guano Islands had always seemed infinite. They weren't. German laboratories were. Between 1900 and 1920, synthetic fertilizer production doubled, then doubled again. By 1930, Germany's ammonia factories were producing more usable nitrogen annually than all the Guano Islands combined had ever yielded in their best years. The stockpiles on the Chincha Islands, millions of tons, representing centuries of bird accumulation, began to look less like an asset and more like a monument to obsolescence. Peru's government tried to adapt. They invested in guano processing. They offered discounts. They lobbied for tariffs. Nothing worked. The real shock came not from the chemistry, but from what happened when a nation lost its reason to control an island. In 1870, the collapse began not with a bang, but with a chemical formula. That year, the German chemist Justus von Liebig had already published his breakthrough work on synthetic nitrogen fixation. But it was two of his successors, Wilhelm Ostwald and Fritz Haber, who would perfect the process. By 1909, the Haber-Bosch process was operational in Germany. Artificial fertilizer could now be manufactured in factories. It was cheaper. It was abundant. It never ran out. The Guano Islands had exactly 30 years left. Peru felt it first. In 1872, guano exports were still worth $40 million annually, roughly $1.2 billion today. By 1880, prices had collapsed by 60%. The market didn't vanish slowly. It hemorrhaged. Chile, which had seized the richest deposits during the War of the Pacific, 1879–1884, found itself sitting on worthless mountains of bird waste. British merchants who had built empires on the trade began liquidating assets. The merchant houses of Liverpool and London stopped bidding. By 1890, guano was essentially unsellable. What remained on the islands was not prosperity, but infrastructure and people. Tens of thousands of workers, Chinese laborers, Peruvian nationals, enslaved and indentured men, had been shipped to islands like the Chincha Islands and Islas Guanaras to extract the commodity. They had lived in camps. They had died in camps. Now the camps were emptying. Some workers were repatriated. Many were not. The colonial machinery that had existed purely to move bird droppings had no secondary purpose. By 1900, the trade was arithmetically zero. The islands were abandoned. What no one calculated in all those ledgers and chemical equations was what would happen to a person when they stopped being profitable. By 1900, the Guano Islands were silent. Not metaphorically. The ships had stopped coming. The work gangs, numbering 30,000 at the industry's peak in the 1870s, had simply evaporated into Peru's interior or boarded steamers bound for Argentine mines and Chilean nitrate fields. What remained was infrastructure designed for a world that no longer existed. Warehouses in Callao, Peru's main port, stood empty. Railroad lines built specifically to move guano sat rusting. The Chincha Islands, which had generated more revenue for Peru than all its other exports combined, became quarantine stations and prisons. One former guano merchant in Lima, whose name survives only in customs ledgers as J. Monteverde, was found dead in 1902, cause unknown, in a boarding house. His estate contained not a single guano contract. In Britain, the collapse triggered a crisis of explanation. Economists struggled to account for the velocity of the loss. The journal The Economist published 7 separate analyses between 1895 and 1898, attempting to reconcile how an industry worth roughly $2 billion annually had simply ceased. They could not. The Peruvian government, desperate to replace lost revenue, began auctioning its islands themselves, their guano exhausted, to competing bidders who hoped to find some residual value in the bird droppings still caked to the rocks. They found none. By 1905, Peru would make a decision about where to look next for wealth, a decision that would reshape its entire relationship with its own earth. Today, you can still see the bones of the guano economy if you know where to look. The Chincha Islands, off Peru's coast, remain largely barren. The massive excavations are visible from satellite. Bird guano still accumulates there, thousands of tons per year, but it sells for almost nothing. A few tons go to organic farmers willing to pay premium prices. The rest stays on the rocks. In Lima's archives, ledgers from 1875 document transactions in the millions. Warehouses that once held guano now hold other cargo or stand empty. The merchant houses that financed guano fleets still exist as buildings. Some are museums. Others are offices. None trade in bird droppings. What the guano collapse taught Peru was this: wealth from a single commodity is fragile. In 1905, the Peruvian government made a calculated turn. Oil. Geologists had spotted crude seeping from the ground in the northern jungle. By 1906, the first commercial wells were sunk. By 1910, Peru was exporting petroleum. History, it seemed, was offering a second act. But the question the guano trade leaves unanswered, the one historians still debate, is whether Peru's elites learned the right lesson. They saw the danger in dependence on one product. But did they see the deeper danger? The danger of believing the earth held infinite replacements. That when one fortune ran out, another would simply appear. The guano barons thought their mountain of bird droppings would never run out, until chemistry proved otherwise. Another file is already open: the rise and fall of the saltpeter monopoly that sparked empires to wage war over rocks. Follow the archive to watch entire economies vanish.